Hello, hello, welcome to Mindset to Results. And this is the next amazing episode which will happen right now because our guest is Jeffrey Besecker, and he is a scientist. He has such a profound approach to limiting beliefs. And this is what we will discuss why limiting beliefs are so powerful. And in many cases, we even not aware of what stops us from creating results and success in life that we desire. Hi,
Hello,
Jeffrey.
Lena. Thank you for having me. This is such an honor to be present with you and with your community.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you being on this show today. So let's speak about limiting beliefs because you know better how they were formed and how they prevent people to grow and live the life through their potential and thrive.
It's an interesting perspective. I wouldn't necessarily say that I know better, but I do have a perspective on
I feel that you know better. That's why I'm so
it. Well, thank you for that feedback.
yeah. That's
That's
why
such an essential part of that process where we are able to accept that feedback and form those interactions where we don't automatically start to step into some of those beliefs. I think that's a great point to start today, Alina.
yes, of course, we always have space to learn, right? And there is the
Correct.
Persian proverb that says that from the day you were born until the day you die, you should learn, right? So it is always level up and level down. But I really believe that you are very, very well established scientist and a person who knows very deep about beliefs. And that's why I really was very um, excited about this topic. So,
Let's
yeah,
sorry. Let's start there and clarify a little bit. I am not specifically a scientist, although I utilize a scientific approach based in empirical evidence.
okay. Scientist also for me, scientist is a person who not just called scientist, but the person who is looking for that deep approach and for deep knowledge, which is not in the surface, right? This is for me. It is like which is based on science, which is based on some laws, right? This is for me as I see you.
Awesome.
Could you please tell, so what did you find in your research about limiting beliefs and about belief system that people have?
So let me give you a little background on myself. Let's start there. And I don't typically just start going through the story of my life. I don't typically just go through all of my experiences. For one specific reason, our subconscious scripts or those stories or narratives are that experience throughout life that we start to record. Large pieces of that information is largely unnoticed. So going back, I was born into this human life. We start recording those experiences from that point to relate that. Going back to birth, we start to record this human experience. I was named Jeffrey Brian Besecker. My legal name by my parents also influences that concept we start to form of self, who and what we believe we are. So, relating that to my journey with why I now practice holistic coaching, understanding why and how those subconscious and unconscious patterns influence our actions, our beliefs, our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, to kind of identify some of the 5 core examples of how they impact our lives. Um, Going back to why I started to connect with that understanding of human behavior, response becomes a little bit relevant, may be relevant if somebody wants to kind of pick part and discern it. So around the age of 5, at 5 or 6, where we start to record some of those emotional interactions, where we start to, more importantly, come into contact with our environment and the patterns of behavior with our environment, beyond belief, beyond response, beyond some of that. We simply start recording both consciously and unconsciously perceptions of that experience. At the age of 6, I started noticing differences in how we perceive and respond to various relationships throughout our social structure and ethnicities, specifically, looking at racial biases and noticing the overt and covert racism now. I'm able as an adult to discern. And I'm going back now and not only comparing where it was as a child with those memories, but with where I am now with feedback as an adult. Being able to compare and contrast is essential in how we form all of our belief systems. We become adaptive, hopefully, when we're moving toward our optimal response. So, as a child, going back to the age of 5 or 6, and why now I can take pieces of my story, and rather than kind of confusedly fumbling through all of our circumstances, especially when they're chaotic, going back and making valued assessments, judgments, and reasoning. Hopefully, we get out of a pattern where that's automatic. So, going back to childhood, noticing how, this person has a different skin color, yet they're being treated differently and feeling emotionally inspired by that, feeling emotionally activated by that. Seeing then how, I can start to form that empathetic view of how now this person is being treated differently than me and forming those associations. So going back, especially now as an adult and seeing where those assessments become maladaptive, we're not able to adapt and consider a different perspective based on certain social structures. So that established where, as a child, I started to notice those things that inspired in me this lifelong curiosity now to study why, as humans, we do specific behaviors, why, as humans, we take specific actions, why, as humans, materialize, and focusing specifically on the human aspect of it. Because, sometimes we feel we have to work on all the aspects to solve all the problems. Sometimes it's more significant to focus on a specific aspect and problem and specialize in that. That's a whole nother conversation we could probably have at another date that kind of dilute things. But back to why it matters now that I'm a coach. I help guide other people to understand these patterns in a clear, actionable manner. That also moves us beyond our emotional triggers and our emotional reactivity. So we're emotionally regulated. We're able to be open and adaptive to move toward an optimal state of being throughout our conscious life. That should
Yeah.
summarize it. Now, from birth, what happens is we start to record these memories. Some of them are conscious. We're able to recall them. We're able to access them. They're within our reach. Those lie within implicit memory. Now, the unconscious part moves over to the, oops, I got that backward, explicit memory. I'm going to admit my fault and mistake there and own where I made an error. I'm not going to be triggered by it. I'm not going to have an emotional response to it. I just simply misspoke the data. So going back, those that we're aware of are explicit. Implicit is when it moves over into that unconscious, subconscious realm, which moves us completely out of the realm of the brain. The brain has a small part in it, but those unconscious processes work throughout our somatic experience. So our somatic experience is every process of our body, every process of our central nervous system, all plays inherently some form or part in that interaction. Yet what we often do is simply say mindset matters. It's all in the brain in our noggin, the brain up here in this part of the body we call the head, simplifying and breaking down categories. So in that regard, yes, what happens in the head does have a significant influence. It does matter. Yet in the greater context and scheme of things, it's not the only thing that matters. What also matters is what happens in our central nervous system. What also matters is what happens in the responses of our heart. What also matters is what happens in our quote unquote gut within the processes of endocrine system, largely chemical responses that form and shape all of those interactions. So in that regard, we start adapting our perspective to understand that all of those processes matter. Yet what we do to go to a quick reasoning is Let's move it to the brain. That allows us to make a quicker decision, or it does reduce that cognitive stress and that emotional stress of, wow, this can be a big concept to chunk down. Chunking up and chunking down becomes an essential process and practice. That becomes a practical application of how we form beliefs and access and utilize the data within our thoughts. That's a very kind of generalization of a much vaster, more nuanced process.
Great. So let's go a little bit deeper in what you just explained. That it is so difficult for people to get in control, right? Because they're not
Yes.
aware of these processes, and many of them, like all these beliefs and different patterns of thinking, also were inherited. Like partly we get them from genes, right? Because this is how we look like our parents and our relatives. And because people are inside of these patterns, it is difficult for them to identify, and they can react to different situations, and they can, as you said, have emotional experience which they don't like, but they still are not aware that they are the cause. And why mindset here starts to be important, right? Because initially it comes with becoming aware. Like, I have the same reactions, I have the same patterns of thinking, of feeling, acting. And if I don't like results which I get, how can I help? How can I help myself? Right? How can I change them? Because most of the people live in the same patterns. They do the same. They have the same thoughts. They have the same reactions, and they don't like how even they react. But they don't have that honesty, or maybe awareness. Yeah, maybe they think that they're honest, but they maybe not have that awareness to understand that something is within them that causes them to behave this way and causes them to have these results which they don't like. It's because when we look at people, they mostly are in the same loop. Like they do the same thing. Even it can be in different areas of life. It can be marriage, it can be business. Yes, like people say, oh, why I attract the same people, like different body but the same, like the same characters, right? All time. Or when I continue losing money, or why I continue making decisions which don't serve me. So this is, I think, very important to let's speak about this a little bit more, because I would like our listeners who listen this episode to understand that so much is habitual behavior. We are creatures of habits, and because those patterns, they were repeated so many times, and our subconscious doesn't identify what is true, what is false, because it is just repeated so many times. And we were infants, we couldn't make decisions. Our parents were deciding what we will eat, what we will dress, right? That's why we like food now, which we eat. It is not because we like this food or we wouldn't like anything else, just because we were given this food when we were infants and small by our parents who like this food, right? That's why this is just became their pattern, and we inherited that. And if we don't really like results which we get, this is the right time to look inside and find out those patterns, and learn how, like from people like you, to find really people who can show you the way how you can identify those patterns which harm you from within, or stop you, block your success, and work on them.
So let's break that down. That was a fairly complex overview of things. Let's start to pick that apart and notice the different parts. Just notice the different parts is where we're going with this. Trying to remain objective, trying to remain flexible, fluid, and adaptive. I'm going to reinforce those values and beliefs because that's essential. The moment we get stuck in our values and beliefs, ventures us off into that trail of becoming a limitation. So, and that becomes much more complex. So, going back, when we're born, we start to record those experiences. Yes, it's factually correct that we have external influences at a young age, up until about the age of 5 or 6, when I started to record some of these memories about noticing differences, just differences, and then associating those with what those differences were. Well, there's a difference in skin color, there's a difference in race that we've built based on cultural expectations and cultural beliefs. In and of themselves, they're inherently neutral until we assign a value to them. They're just an experience, they're just a sensory perception, they're just an emotional response. We create all the values that we use to assess them based on where those beliefs fall. It's an interactive process. If there's an emotional trigger, sometimes that becomes more emotionally salient. That emotional response is there to simply bring our awareness to our interactions. We form all the values and meanings on that. We start to build what we feel and believe. That meaning is there to signal for us. Becomes entirely subjective. And to break it down, it becomes overly simplified, but we base that largely on our core automatic response for survival. Starts that chain of default neural programming. Neural being all of those nerve connections, nerve interactions, energetic connections throughout our body. There's where we can start to interject any concept of energetics, where we start to sometimes form beliefs that themselves are limited based on a limited knowledge of how energetic systems work. Frequency being one. We lump sum that a lot of times into this one concept that frequency is one thing, yet our thoughts have a measure of energy, and it's not always based on frequency. Our chemical interactions of our hormones have an energetic frequency based in chemical reactions that don't inherently rely on frequencies. All of our thoughts, feelings, all of our embodied processes, literally, I can't even break it down into a fathomable number, probably, because it's so nuanced and complex. So, first and foremost, going back to looking at belief systems and how we oversimplify. I'm stepping away here, but I hope this is one example that illustrates. We generalize it based on that core survival element that says, I need to make a quick decision here about whether or not what my emotion is bringing awareness to me to form a reaction in the form of response. Default neural programming. Its core purpose is to continue our materialized existence as a human being. I'm showing you, hopefully, when the viewers, if they can see my hands, I'm going from side to side. What I'm hoping to illustrate and reinforce with this continued visual interaction is that that's a spectrum between both ends of that interaction. What we often do is only focus on one simple aspect of that perspective, and we discount all the rest. We go to that quick action. Will this guarantee my survival? And how much stress does that put on my somatic systems, head to toe, left arm to right arm, all the way outstretched, up high? And within that lies all of this myriad of frequencies, electrical interactions. I'm simplifying it there because I can go really deep on my study and awareness of that. But we simplify it down to just simply relate that to, does this emotion lead me to a perspective where I might be stressed and where I might be challenged by whether or not I continue as a materialized human being? So, back to how that forms and informs where we go with belief systems. We start to gauge and evaluate everything on those two factors. The two core factors is, do I feel like this inherently somehow challenges my sense of survival? And is it triggered by any emotional response? We start to form the values and beliefs on that. We largely start to model what we experience in our environment. If we don't experience an environment where we have a beneficial, healthy, adaptive model of beliefs that say our emotions are inherently just a signal, we start to record messages. If we start to record messages that say emotions are positive, emotions are negative, we start to limit and narrow that view. Becomes binary thinking, which itself is a limiting belief. Emotions are inherently neutral. We add the value and belief to it. Now, you can look at an emotion like anger. We start to then culturally build beliefs that, well, now I feel threatened, challenged. So what do? I either avoid or defend against the experience of that emotion in general, because now I don't know what to do with this. And we see where we reinforce that culturally. We start to say, well, now belief about emotions dictates that it's positive, negative. It's inherently bad. It's inherently discomforting. It can be discomforting because some of the behavioral interactions, some of the actions are inherently adverse or unhealthy, maladaptive. We start to form a broader perspective that's only considering, we start with positive, negative, and it's only two choices. Going back to your concept of considering choices. Now, when we're in an interaction where we are physically threatened or we're being mentally, emotionally, psychologically abused, what we've labeled abuse, those instances that bring down that sense of value, bring down that sense of purpose, bring down that sense of importance, and more importantly, make us feel unsafe. We record that in our central nervous system first and foremost. It's an embodied, meaning within core systems beyond the brain. Then we've kind of used diluted language to identify it, because where we started to identify it, we didn't have that degree and understanding of it. Well, I had a thought, we start to label what a thought was. Well, did the thought predicate it, or was the original source in our central nervous system? Now, as we study that evolving understanding of how emotions interact, we understand now that it becomes increasingly more and more difficult to understand and identify exactly where those interactions are, because they tend to float to different locations depending on different circumstances and different stimuli. So what do? We want to move toward that quick decision. Well, I don't have time to process all of this degree of context and nuance, all of this data. Now it starts to feel overwhelming because I feel threatened, and I either want to avoid or defend against the emotional element. I want to move toward a quicker decision because now I feel quote unquote unsafe and insecure. I feel a challenge or a recalcitrant emotional response. Recalcitrant simply meaning that discomfort or struggle we feel with an emotion becomes a little more contextualized, because we start to realize that, well, it's a vast amount of experiences and there are differences and nuances. When we understand the differences and nuances, we're able to adapt that belief to find an inherently more optimal value to assign it.
Yeah, thank you for this profound explanation. So, what about these beliefs that people don't serve people, and these beliefs are so strong that even when people can be given some reasons showing, like proving that this is not serving them, they still prefer to keep them. How
So
you would
let's
describe that?
focus on that a bit. Now, we've come up with a concept called the backfire effect, where a belief inherently becomes limiting. I'm going to simplify that down so we can start to build upon the framework of that context. Ultimately, all of our beliefs are looking for value, depth, meaning, and what is the impact within my internal system, and how does that then influence the environment? That's a processes. Consciously, we're all basically the same energy. We're all interconnected. We're all existing within the same plane of quote unquote perceptual reality. That's kind of bringing in, and that's maybe discounting some of the spiritual consideration, what happens when we leave the material body, what extent of our existence lies beyond that. That's a whole nother conversation I feel we could spend hours on. Going back to belief, we're looking at what challenges again my sense of safety, why it challenges. Do I have a limited range of context or understanding of data? We're going back to that. I need to make a quick decision. So ultimately, what we do is form belief structures, and they're just structures. They're pieces of a puzzle we put together to make sense of things. That's oversimplifying it, but hopefully creates that foundation. If we feel challenged in making sense of things, forming meaning, understanding what's going to happen, then we become very oftentimes either emotionally triggered or conceptually triggered. And sometimes the emotion part is absent because what we do when we feel those recalcitrant emotions that make us feel uncomfortable, we either avoid or defend against them, and then we suppress them, meaning we don't process the data that's available within them. Now, just like if I were to label someone and say, you're a horrible person, you're a negative person, we start to then feel that sense of threat. And the same goes for labeling then the emotion. If we say our anger is a horrible emotion, then we start to form that belief that it doesn't have an intrinsic value that becomes beneficial. We're going beyond just the condition part that says, well, it's either positive or negative because cultural influence told me. Doesn't discount the value of cultural influence because literally every idea and concept we have is based on a value or a belief that existed before us and we build upon it. All of our conceptual knowledge, all of our vocabulary knowledge, all of our statistical knowledge, applied to the mathematics. Somebody formed a value and system before we were here in this material human body. It inherently has a neutral value, and we make the meaning beyond that. We can either say, well, that's a positive or negative value. Sometimes that view or perspective becomes distorted.
Yes, and what can help people to break through those conditions and those patterns? And what do you think can help them to create new beliefs? Because the old beliefs, as we had formed them since we were very small, they have very big power. And I noticed when I was working on changing some habits, as Bob Proctor called them, paradigms. It is not easy. Like even if you understand that you don't want to do certain things, but you can find out that you just do it subconsciously, right? Or you can say that okay, I know I have to do these things, and you still not do it. So this is such a big condition. Like when we become aware of this, we understand that there is like something in our body that just wants us to keep stuck, like keep in the same patterns when we were, and when it is like something inside of us wants to control what we do, how we do, and everything in our life. And when we become aware of this and understand that some of these patterns don't show us, that they don't, for example, for me, like when I was through this personal development process and just waking up from that hypnotic state, which I was 40 years. And when I was taking actions, I was feeling really bad, like physically bad. I could have headache, I could have anxiety, and it is like something like you want to just break something in you, like to die as your old self and get born as a new self. And this is process which really needs that consistency and consciousness, being aware of really who you meant to be, that those programs, they were not even installed by us, right? As we discussed, those programs were installed by our parents, by people who were around us, teachers. And and when we don't work on our this process of awakening and getting back our power, getting back control, nothing happens. That's why people write New Year resolutions at the end of December, and they say like from 1st January, I will go gym, I will stop smoking, or I will do this and this, and they can have a very long list, and it can seem very reasonable, right? And it can be very sincere that they really want to be better father or better husband or wife or whatever. But we see that it doesn't work that way, because those inside programs, they just find so many reasons why not to do. Like if you want to go running every day and you decided to run, there will be rain, and your inner voice will tell you it is raining, just take care of yourself, sleep today more, and tomorrow you will run, right? So let's discuss a little bit about these powerful programs and why it is really important to become aware of them and understand that this is time to get our power back and get committed to make the change. And another question, what is the best way you think that how we can make the change and get into control?
So let's start by breaking that first. We went into what we often do is create that story and narrative. We're trying to explain why and how we've experienced it. Back to those subconscious scripts. They're just those patterns and programs that guide our actions, form our behaviors, and interact with our emotional inputs. They also extend to how we sense and perceive things, how we take in information and data from our environment, which is essentially just as important, if not more important, than what we perceive from our own self filtered perspectives. If we feel threatened by that external feedback, that external data, inherently the data is neutral, it's just information. We create all of the perception of the value. If we feel any kind of existential threat, external threat based on what that input and value is, beyond that construct we create, that box we put ourselves in, it's just a foundation, it's just a structure to hold all of our human stuff, all of the data, all the information, all of our experiences. And it's just a concept. Just like the concept of a bird, just like the concept of driving a car is a concept. It's an idea and a series of values, a series of meanings. If we can't step out of that perspective and consider it from something beyond that concept, the self inherently becomes a limitation because we're not willing to vulnerably consider and adapt to a perspective that we feel originates within that box. So, to relay that idea, I had a great conversation yesterday with my good friend Mark Fournet, who also is a coach, looking at how we adapt and adopt our optimal patterns of behavior. So Mark sums it up like this: that idea or concept of self is like a transparent box when we're born. It's a foundation, it's a structure, it's a piece of the puzzle. We're empty. Essentially, we believe, yet are we? Because we're starting then to develop greater context and nuance of the influence of epigenetics. How much of that begins before we exit the birth canal of our mother, or now we're starting to look at genetic engineering, which becomes a whole nother consideration, and we start to form values and opinions of that. We inherently think that when we come out of that blankness is inherently us. Yet we're inherently both equally parts of the parental genome. We have those cells that create us. So inherently from the start, we're not independently this thing we call a self. We're from the very get go, very factually and realistically, equal parts, not only our mother and father, but everybody throughout our genetic trail is now an influential factor on us. And we're starting to pick apart that nuance with awareness, conscientiousness, understanding, focus. We're trying to find the context and meaning in that. So, what we do is we start with where we start that box from birth. And inherently, we don't have, from our understanding and awareness, that ability to conceptualize it, to make value and meaning of it. Till about the age again of 4, 5, 6, 7, we start to form some of those. And some of those are formed by the influence. There again, if we only notice what we deem or label a negative influence or a threatening influence or adverse influence or a maladaptive influence, then what are we doing? We're focusing on that thing. Becomes a conscious biases known as the focusing effect based on confirmation bias. We're trying to confirm what we feel and believe to be true, yet there's a greater context at play that you did receive genetic material not only from your mother and father, but also from the past, from all of your ancestral lineage. Now, the same thing happens within our cultural aspect of being. Inherently, we don't speak a language of our own making to the largest degree. Now, we add context and nuance to it. We all have different ways of communicating it in a lot of ways. But we start with that core building block that we don't have a language till a language is passed on to us. Now, we can form a value judgment on that. We can form a belief about it. Now, if we've had a emotionally challenging or emotionally uncomfortable interaction, a trauma, something that become very noticeable because we inherently felt unsafe, insecure, and threatened, then we start to form protective, avoidant, and defensive ways of avoiding that past experience. We're trying to cope now with my belief is based on that past experience, largely what was unconscious beyond the conscious. In that instance, when the emotion is suppressed, because we start to avoid that discomfort when we're younger, and especially when we're younger, because we can't form valued reasoning. We can't form logic because our brains haven't developed in a manner to start first and foremost making those healthy comparisons and contrasts. We haven't learned to adapt because we're limited in experience. There is an element of experiential learning where we can then form healthy, viable, adaptive comparisons, hopefully, where let me take this experience. I'm traveling down this path and I ran into this tree. So the next time, what do? I'm going down the path again. I want to make sure that I don't meet that resistance of the tree. I want to make sure that if I was injured in that tree, by hitting it, I don't do that again. If I felt bad about it, I want to make sure I don't do that again. So we start to avoid and defend those when we feel triggered, when we feel emotionally traumatized. It becomes a very gray area of consideration. So back to how that influences our beliefs. Those emotional interactions, if we're able to develop regulation, experience the emotion, and say, now I experience an emotion. It's just emotion to start. We can start to say it's positive. We can start to say it's negative. We can start to say it's healthy. We can start to say it's unhealthy. We can start to label it and say it's adaptive or maladaptive. We can even take those responses. Well, now because it's maladaptive, I form a view and opinion of this concept that I'm building called a self within this theoretic box, this transparent box of being. So going back to Mark, Mark Furrier shares that as we're going through our experiences, we're writing them down and recording them, much like jotting it down on a Post-it sticky note. And what we do is eventually we're posting those notes and they're recording both in our explicit and implicit memory. Explicit is what is conscious and aware. It's what we notice. Implicit is over here. We're not aware, we're not conscious, we're not noticing it. Parts of those experiences are embodied processes. Like you can't sense when you're triggered a gut interaction and you're releasing in your endocrine system the actual process. What we experience is the after effect. We experience the rise in cortisol. We feel, my blood pressure will rise and I turn red in a variety of responses. Whether I label that positive or negative, whether that's, what we label a recalcitrant difficult emotion, I tend to operate my system, and you can tell when my energetic level is shifting, when there are different responses because my face turns red. We start to form values and assumptions on that. So, back to those responses, we don't inherently sense what's going on internally. So, we start to form values and meanings based on the uncertainty. I'm looking for that idea of infinite control rather than understanding that there are so many variables in life that are beyond our awareness, first and foremost, because we're not consciously recording it, at least on the ability that we're accessing it and utilizing it. And then there are just factors where, I can't control you. I can influence you. I can't control the weather, although we're watching now as science is trying to infinitely control it. And what they're actually doing is stimulating it and influencing it. We're seeing where nature itself says, no, there is no control here. And we see some of those effects. We see where climate change, and when we start to do scientific things to manipulate that, the outcome is much different than what we intended. We do the same thing with our internal systems. We're trying to change the environment, first and foremost, of our emotional content. I feel threatened and challenged again. It's that simple. When we go to the core function and structure, the core practice, practical knowledge, this was a point that I'm trying to find, a bridge between developing large theories. What can we apply and take action on is simply a practice, becomes practical application of knowledge.
Yes, exactly. So, if we want to make it clear for people who want to change their habits, who want to change their patterns of behavior, for example, is simple, like let's say, for example, multitasking. That if person is conditioned to do multitasking, it was before with me. I was thinking that it says that in like in woman body, that because I could type in Ukrainian language and speak English and do something like keep my feet in jacuzzi and it's like I could do so many things, and I was thinking that it is my superpower.
Hmm.
And I was thinking that it's totally fine that I can do so many tasks at the same time. And then I learned that I have to focus on one task at a time. And I understood this, that I have to focus to become more productive, to get things done. I should focus on one task. But it took me time to start focusing on one task, because it is like in like something in you, if you are conditioned to do things certain way, you understand that you want to do things different, but your body, it rejects the new way. So it just, you can just, I just want to share from my experience when I became aware of my that habitual behavior, and I was intentionally focusing on doing one task. It was not easy. My body wanted to jump and doing something else. And then when I recognized that I wanted to do something else, I was just bringing back my intention and attention to this task. And it took time to till I changed this behavior. So what you would like to, like, what you could share about this, like how people first can become aware of those patterns, because we don't know what we don't know, and we can even think that something is like we are superhuman when we do so many things and it doesn't serve us. And when we want to change, it is not easy. I would say it is like a fight. It for me it was feeling like I'm fighting with something strong in me that wants me to do things the habitual way. And now I come here and say, oh, okay, now I want to do something different. And that part of me say, no, no, you're not going to do that different. I want you to do the way how you was, how we were before, for example, 40 years. And it was good, right? We
So
collaborated.
let's break that apart. I want to bring attention and awareness to that idea of superhuman superpowers. Are we not all inherently human? Would you agree or disagree with that
Yeah,
from a
of
belief
course.
perspective? So, why do we feel we have to do anything beyond our natural abilities to be human?
What do you mean natural
So,
abilities?
why do we then label it superpower or superhuman when we're just being human from that
Okay, see,
perspective?
what I meant that when I was doing multitasking, it didn't serve me because I could start many different things and didn't finish either of them. So it was not being superhuman. I could think that I was because I could just think and do so many times, but in reality, it was not superhuman because I didn't accomplish anything what I planned to do. Although I could be busy all the day.
So, let's rein that back in then a little bit. Ultimately, would you agree, or what is your view that you're looking for certainty? You're looking for that sense of security, correct?
In that time when I was working on this aspect of my performance, I was looking on effectiveness, productivity to do things which I decided and I knew that I want to do.
So, from that perspective, setting that value becomes a goal attached to an expectation, does it not?
Yes.
So, you start to project then a belief about what will transpire to meet that value and validate that goal. We start to form an expectancy bias. I expect this to happen when inherently we know a core experience of being human is that degree of uncertainty, that insecurity of the unknown. What do we start to do then? We start to create an outcome because now we're emotionally triggered, we're emotionally activated. We feel that data of emotion. Now I'm uncomfortable because I can't control the outcome. I can only influence it because I can't make you do things. I can't control when somebody makes an error in judgment. I can't control, especially the things that are unconscious outside of our awareness, especially when it's ingrained in the implicit memory until we go through a chain of commands to bring that forward and access some of those things. Just like that bias, we're often not aware as I'm giving you feedback on a perception of that bias. We're starting to expect what happens, which is inherently just a value. It can become a beneficial, adaptive, healthy, optimal value when we consider all of the aspects. When we apply the part of the habit that serves that optimal behavior and outcome. So, by developing consistency, showing up, but also being flexible to say there are instances where things need a different perspective and consideration. If we inherently become maladaptive, now I know I've exceeded my energy expenditure. I know I've overstepped a healthy boundary of homeostasis where stress is now a core factor because what am I doing? I'm fearful of the fact that I don't know what's going to happen. I'm insecure about the uncertainty. So I start to worry. I start to ruminate, which rumination we often generalize again back to simply overthinking. But when we go deeply, what happens is we're actually caught in a core central nervous pattern in the autonomic nervous system called the autonomic ladder. It measures the steps up and down at its kind of generalized aspect, how well we're equipped to adapt to that stress. Plain and simple, to put in a very simplified, hopefully foundational structure. So now now we're triggered by an emotion. Triggered just simply meaning we feel the stimulus. We're forming a new perspective because sometimes that word trigger, we start to form values and associations on. Now we start to make assumptions. Now we go back to that expectancy bias. I'm starting to confer a value and belief upon it. I'm starting to now project and infer through selective inference and selective reinforcement. The more I tell myself that that's the value and belief, the more we become cemented in it, the more we hold on to it, the more we resist considering any outside perspective, and especially when it comes from outside of this transparent box we call the self. We start reading all of the post-it notes in the box telling us what we recorded as our perception, yet we've missed the feedback. So here's one way to illustrate that, and I'm going to turn the lens back to you. One way to illustrate that: when we drive down the road, it's inherently valuable that we make some automatic judgments. It's inherently valuable that we share a common set of structures and foundational values about what it means to be on that road. So it's inherently valuable that there's a red square or whatever, the red is and the meaning of that, depending on what the law is of different cultures even. When we see that signal in the road, it is a value that we have a shared opinion and view of that. That means stop, that we don't progress and interrupt somebody else's influence. If we make that error, then we have another series of interactions. We have another series of outcomes. We have another series of influence and results. So turning that to compare with social values. It's inherently a value that we have ideas and beliefs that transfer from our parents because they have had those experiences. They can start to compare and contrast for us. Now, if that becomes distorted or filtered sometimes, and I'll get to that here in a minute, we start to see a different perspective depending on, who's inputting it, whether it's a distorted perspective from the outside or distorted perspective from the inside. It's big, so I'm going to take a deep breath here. Inherently, the more open and adaptive we are to those feedbacks, it just becomes additional ways to leverage that value.
Yes, and the way how to change those patterns, that
So,
again, from my experience, it is through repetition and through changing self-image. Like when you create the identity, like who you are, right? Like what you do, what you don't do. And through repetition and becoming conscious and just doing the new way again and again, and in time it becomes more habitual. Like this is how I was, like what I experienced. Like this multitasking for me was really took time till I became aware of that and was studying, practicing intentionally new way how I would do things.
so relating to that, is it a healthy habituation or an unhealthy? Is it adaptive or maladaptive? Is it beneficial or adverse? We're adding context again. Now we can do the same automatic habituated pattern again, drawing from just that unconscious awareness, default neural programming, which moves beyond the brain again because neural imprinting occurs not only in the brain, neural imprinting occurs in the heart, neural imprinting occurs in the central nervous system at the autonomic ladder. Neural imprinting even ventures into our intuitive responses and starts to record data, both consciously and unconsciously. Now, when we look at that idea of intuition, what we're largely doing is bringing all of these systems together. The gut brain axis, it's accessing memory, it's making comparisons, it's also interacting with where your nervous system is programmed. And again, that is completely automatic at its deepest core. It's automatically a default neural program to move you toward your survival states, adapting where we are as human beings, collective evolution. We've recorded those experiences. So again, consistency alone can sometimes be maladaptive. If we're not adapting to change, if we're not evolving, if we're not considering perspectives, especially if we can't step out of the framework of a self, inherently that's challenging to most of us because we're automatically in that protective mode. Oh, now I'm threatened because you're trying to take this idea of me away. But inherently, those become ego processes. That's a whole nother concept that we could probably spend another couple hours on. But to break that down, we often move toward that maladaptive sense of ego that only looks at the aspect of protection. The ego serves as a series of processes that reinforce the values and beliefs that construct our psyche, our sense of self, and our relationships. And it extends even in the definition. If you look at the concept of psyche and where we've defined the values of its definition, if we consider a broader context, it includes how we form associations. Associations are those values, those judgments, those discernments, making that value and meaning, and then also being open to feedback. Because if you're not aware of what's happening in your environment, if you're not aware of a different perspective, if you're not recording a differing experience, that value is simply not present to utilize. We're not adapting and allowing that value to become beneficial to us.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. It is really a very deep and interesting conversation, and I'm sure that people who listen to us get a lot of value. And yeah, I would love to meet again, and we can speak about ego. That is also a very good topic to know what holds us back. So thank
Thank you
you
so
very much.
much, Elena. This has truly been such a heartfelt connection today, and I truly have valued simply being present and also listening to your perspective and considering and simply absorbing because I have learned and taken away so much from my own experience to share also as we move forward. So thank you for that opportunity.
You're most welcome, and looking forward to our next episode.
Likewise.